what we'd like to do is just introduce ourselves and let you know how the webinar will run for today. So I'm Helen Wozniak, the person talking at the moment. I work for Flinders University, and I've been working with Narelle over the last couple of years delivering clinical supervision training and also this resource, which we'll talk more about in a moment. My background's actually in orthoptics, in eyes, so that's where my background is, and I'll hand over to Narelle to introduce herself too.
Hi everyone, I'm Narelle Campbell. Helen and I both work for Flinders Northern Territory. We're based in Darwin, and we've been doing this work looking at peer review of clinical supervision, particularly across the top end of Australia. However, there seems to be a lot of interest, and we notice from the people that have registered that people from all over Australia have joined us. So we're going to just talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. My background is speech pathology. My current role is in the medical program here in the Northern Territory, and I'm really excited about this work we're doing. It's a good project, and I'm sure that you'll learn some things from the introduction that we're going to give you this afternoon. So thanks for coming.
Okay, what I should actually let people know is that we are actually planning to record the session and make it available at a later time, and we will be telling you where a lot of the resources are. So when we have the recording, what is recorded is actually what you're seeing on the screen, so you won't actually see the chat appearing in the recording. And you won't see a list of who everybody is. And we will actually going to turn off our videos now because it really does chew up bandwidth, and some people don't always have the best connection. So we've decided that we'll actually, you've seen who we are, so we might actually turn off our cameras and continue on speaking. And so we'll do that now. Okay, so we've introduced ourselves. What we wanted to do is just give you a bit of an overview of what's going to happen in the next hour. So in our session, I'm going to just give a little bit of information about how the session will run, how we actually use some of the tools that are on the screen in front of you. We're going to find out a little bit about who is actually here by running some polls. Then we will give you more of an overview of what we're talking about when we mention peer review of clinical supervision, and then we're going to actually have a go at doing some peer review of a supervisor. So without any further ado, if you're new to the interface, and we are as well, so what I wanted to let you know is that depending on how you actually got into this training, you might get slightly different screens. So one of the screens you could have would be like this control panel here, and it may not look exactly like this. If you don't see that panel, this little orange arrow, if you accidentally click on that, it will disappear, so that you need to sort of move it back out again. We're going to concentrate on using the chat box, which is what people have been doing. And we can see there's a question about where we'll find the recording. We'll address that a little bit later. It's going to be on the GNARTN website eventually. So what you can do, if the chat is getting too long, you can actually undock the chat section just by clicking that button there, and that will allow you to move the chat to a part of your computer where you can resize it if you want to. We haven't enabled the microphones for everybody because there simply were just too many people online at the one time, and it does take a lot of time to turn people's microphones on and off. So that's our choice that we've decided not to. Sometimes you get a lot of feedback in these sessions, so we didn't really want to. We had enough to do, and we're hoping that you'll be okay with using the chat box as the main method of talking to us. And you can actually minimize this whole screen if you want to as well. Now, if you came in with the web version, it's fairly similar, and you've got a chat section there as well. As I said, we can't spend a lot of time ironing out web and IT issues. So if it's the first time that you've been to a webinar, well done for getting here in the first place. And please feel free to use the chat box. We will be looking at that during the whole session. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do was to actually find out some information about who you are. And so Narelle in a moment is going to put up some polls for you to actually complete. So you can just directly get that now. And I'm going to put up a question in the chat box if I can make sure I put it in the right place. So have a go at answering the poll that's there at the moment. And I'm going to put a question as well into the chat box. And feel free while you're waiting for the polls to work to have a go at answering the question that's in the chat box, because we're interested in what strategies you currently use to develop your supervision skills. So there's multitasking here. Have a go at voting on the poll. We're interested in knowing where you've come from. And our apologies to New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia and the ACT for putting you together in one group. This project emerged out of work done in GNARTN, which is the top half of Australia, and we were interested in knowing how well we've met our needs of participating with people in the area of GNARTN, which is the northern part of Australia. Wow, Nicole's been doing some peer review. We'd love to hear more about that if you want to chat any more in the chat box. So, having a look at the poll results, and this is where I might...
Helen, would you like me to talk
Yes, sorry,
them?
I'm catching up. If you'd like to, Narelle, go for it.
Okay, so we're about a quarter of us from the NT, a quarter from Queensland, 21% from Western Australia, and the remainder of the participants, 30%, are from the other states and one person from outside Australia. So when I saw that question, I thought, I wonder if they're actually on the internet from beyond Australia, or whether we worded the question slightly oddly. We meant, where are you right now today? But if you answered it as, you know, your place of origin, well, welcome anyway. All right, let's move to the second poll. We want to know where your main work location is in terms of urban, rural, or remote. All right, nearly 2/3 of you have voted. I'm going to close it again in a minute, so take your last chances to get your votes in. Okay, and I'm going to close it now. And here we can see that nearly 2/3 of us are from in urban areas, mainly working, 21% in rural and 17% in remote. And I guess for Helen and I, we have a major interest in remote areas because of being from the Northern Territory. And we do think that peer review might be a really useful professional development strategy for people who are in rural and remote areas. All right, our third poll. We want to know how many other health professionals you work with. So how many people do you have access to? So start voting on this, and the reason that this is important is because, as you've probably gathered from the title, you need someone to do this professional development strategy with. It's about a peer, finding a peer. So vote. Tell us whether you're really, really isolated, don't have anybody to work with, or you've, got a large group of other health professionals that you could access when you're thinking about who might be your peer. All right, I'm going to close that poll in just a few seconds. We're nearly at 90% of people voting. And the votes seem to have slowed down. So I'm going to close it and show it to you. Oh, I'm so glad nobody is totally on their own. A small percentage, 9% of you work with a small team. A lot of us have up to 10 people, so 20%, and then 70% are in very large areas, and that probably mimics the locations that we're from. In fact, from an urban area, a large, 2/3 of people were from an urban area and probably have more access to peers, but nevertheless we all have access to some peers. All right, and our final poll, before I hand back to Helen, is about your supervision. Do you have supervision experience? Do you currently supervise other people who have less experience than you? And we intentionally worded it as supervising others, so we're talking about not only supervising students, but maybe new graduates, maybe junior staff, maybe someone new to the area of practice that you're in. And again, we've got 80% of people voted so far, so get your last votes in before I close it. All right, and I'm going to close it now. And there we go, 90% of us, 89% of us are supervising others. So highly relevant, the topic for today's webinar about peer reviewing our supervision, because most of us are currently supervising others, and presumably if you're not supervising others, it's something you'd like to do, and so you want to find out about this particular strategy. All right, Helen, can I pass back to you to summarise the answers to the question?
Yes, thanks very much, Narelle, for leading us through that. Yes, what we wanted to really get is to people to share how they actually currently develop their supervision skills. And just scrolling through, there's some really varied strategies, mostly related to workshops, but I was really encouraged to see the number of people who are also looking at other strategies like learning from their peers, having informal discussions with their peers. A few people mentioned that they did do peer review as well, so we would love to get some feedback for you on what you think of the resource that we've actually developed, because it really came out of our development of workshops where we did quite a lot of training of supervisors in the Territory. Over 200 different people have attended various workshops that we've run, and we've tried various strategies of, we all know we go to workshops and we have enthused with ideas, and then we come back and we don't always necessarily put everything into practice. So this, we developed a resource which you'll hear more about, to try and look at a way of being flexible but still giving people some guidelines as to how they might approach this peer review process. It's used a lot in universities and in other professions, and we do peer review our own clinical practice often, as we're beginning practitioners, having someone to assist us in making our clinical decisions. But we felt that there was a bit of a gap in the area of actually improving our supervisory practice. So I'll hand back to Narelle, who's going to talk a little bit more about what we actually mean by peer review of clinical supervision.
Thanks, Helen. This little diagram that we've put up really summarises what the literature says and the conclusions we've come to around what peer review of clinical supervision is. And it really is something different from clinical supervision itself, and it can be just take a little bit of thinking to get your head around. So if you'll notice that we've got a Venn diagram with two ovals, two circles. The one on your right is the clinical supervision triad, I guess. So there might be a supervisor who's supervising a learner, and the learner is working with the patient. And this is an important thing to think of, that the clinical supervision that the supervisor is offering the learner is separate from the peer review of clinical supervision. So when you have participate in a process of peer review of clinical supervision, the relationship that you might have as the peer reviewer is with the supervisor. It's not with the learner, and it's not with the patient. You are there for the supervisor. The supervisor has selected you. You've gone through a process to negotiate what you're actually going to be looking at in terms of their supervision, and you do some kind of observation, and then you meet again to actually debrief and to give feedback. But as the peer reviewer, you are working with the supervisor. You are not working with the learner, and you are not working with the patient. That remains the responsibility of the supervisor in the clinical supervision triad. And if you think about it in this way, it really helps you untangle, I guess, the relationships and the responsibilities that you have, and helps limit what you're actually doing. Makes it manageable.
Great, Narelle. So what we wanted to do next was to show you, explain a little bit more about what we mean by the peer review of clinical supervision. So we're going to give you what we've got, if I just get this right, I've actually put a link to a YouTube video into the chat box.
Introducing work-based peer review of clinical supervision. For many health professionals, supervising learners is part of everyday practice. Others, particularly those of us working in more remote areas, might only supervise someone every now and then. For many professionals, supervision is just one aspect of the work they are required to do, and maybe just an expected add-on to their already busy clinical caseload. Supervising others can be either a rewarding or taxing experience. When it's rewarding, we feel positive about the experience and our contribution to developing someone else in our profession. On the other hand, if it's taxing, the learner might have poor knowledge, be juggling other demands, or lack insight into their poor professional communication or behaviour. We can feel weighed down and unsure about what to do to remediate the situation. Peer review of supervision has been shown to improve both the supervisor and learner's experience of the supervision. What is peer review of supervision? Typically, during supervision in a health setting, 3 people are involved: the learner, who is working directly with the patient, and you as the supervisor, ensuring that the learner is providing quality care. When we talk about peer review of supervision, we add in a 4th person, a peer of the supervisor. The role of the peer is to observe you, the supervisor, and to provide you with a helpful critique on the supervision process. In fact, the peer review process can be as illuminating for the peer reviewer as it is for you. David Gosling, a UK-based expert in peer review of university teaching, has defined peer review as a voluntary system of professional support that can assist supervisors at any stage of their career to gain valuable insights into their supervisory practice within a confidential, caring climate. Listen to what health professionals have said about being reviewed by a peer.
I've been teaching for 35 years, and this is the first time I've ever been observed by a peer, focused on my teaching role. Thank you. It's good to know that I'm doing some things right, along with some things I can improve.
I'm grateful that you've set up this regular peer supervision, as it's much needed in a rural area where it's too easy to work in a vacuum. Being part of a group gives a sense of connectedness and reduces feelings of isolation, which is beneficial for clients and practitioners.
I think the biggest influence of the peer supervision group is the great diversity of approaches and outlooks, as well as our own personal expectation of ourselves in our professional work.
From the literature, we know that there are a number of important benefits from working with a peer to review your supervisory practice. These include gaining new ideas that you can use when you are supervising, and so broadens your supervision. magnifies and focuses your attention on what you are doing when you are supervising, so you become more aware of your practice. It helps the organisation embrace supervision as part of the culture. Regularly discussing and sharing ideas about supervision encourages an openness to supervision, so that staff become involved and inspired. Supervision becomes commonplace. Of course, undertaking a peer review of your supervision requires some planning, both from the perspective of the logistics and the focus of the observation. So what now? One of the first decisions you need to make is to select a peer. In a remote area, you might think it would be more challenging to find a peer. However, there are almost no restrictions on who can be your peer. Your peer doesn't need to be in the same profession, just need to have confidence that you can work together. They don't need to be an experienced supervisor. They do need to have some time to contribute as your peer reviewer. They generally shouldn't be your manager. It's best if they can meet with you face to face. They should be someone you can trust. In the toolkit, you will find steps to lead you through the peer review process. This includes ways you can implement peer review, sample checklists and template guides where you can choose what you want the review to focus on, and then select the descriptors to guide your peer during the review. It also provides tips to assist you when giving feedback to your peer. So that's it, a brief introduction to the process of working with a peer to review your supervision. Here's a URL to look at the toolkit. http://tinyurl.com/km6tugr. Or you can go to the GNARTN homepage and enter the word peer into the search bar. This project was funded by GNARTN and Flinders University in the Northern Territory, Australia.
Okay, everyone. So moving on from the video, what we want to do is just point out a couple of aspects in relation to a peer review process. There's nothing really special about it, but it's certainly, if as we did our research and tried to customise it for the environment of clinical supervision in the health sector, we came up with some general components which would mean that peer review would work well. And so they're just described in this this slide here. It's not really a step process where you have to do one before the other, but it does give you a bit of a guide as to what's important to make a peer review process work well. And we explain this more in the guide as well. So to point out, one of the things we will actually be participating in this area over here, but it does help if we have to imagine that some of these other things have happened before what we're going to actually look at now. So we suggest it's really important to make a plan and to think about what exactly you do want to be able to be peer reviewed about, and to give your peer some guidance as to what specifically you would like them to review when it comes to your clinical supervision practice. And we created a peer review tool with a number of different domains, and they match the National Competency Framework, which was developed for clinical supervisors. And the idea is that you could, in your own time, have a look at that that tool and read through all the different descriptors that are described there that can help you decide what aspect of clinical supervision you would like your peer to focus on. Then we've got guidance about developing the climate, and it's very much peer review is not an evaluative approach, and what we wanted to do was to get people to understand the collaborative nature of peer review. It's not necessarily an evaluative type of strategy. We have some guidance about how you should choose your peer, and luckily from that poll, many of you look like you have lots of people you can choose between. And so if you are to undertake a peer review process, if you follow some of those guidelines initially, you'll actually find it easier to actually do the peer review process. We suggest a few different models as well. So we're going to undertake a model where we're going to give you the form, and we're going to show you an interaction between a supervisor and a student and ask you to review the supervisor's practices, how well they supervise that particular student. then generally it would be a good idea to engage in some sort of debriefing and evaluation of the process. And a lot of the research has found that the person actually doing the reviewing it actually learns a lot in the whole process as well, as well as the person who's asked to have their supervision actually reviewed. So we do describe each of these components of a peer review process in the educational resource, which we will give you the link to that towards the end of the webinar. So what we're going to get you to do now is we had some materials which were available to you prior to the session, but you should also have a little near the chat box, there'll be a section above that that says materials, and that's just a PDF of a recording sheet which we're going to ask you to use when you look at the next video. So you have to imagine that you've been in the situation where a peer has asked you to be your peer reviewer, and they've asked you to observe a session where they're giving feedback to the learner. And so your peer has come up with, has had a look and has created this review tool in the form of a checklist for you to use while you're observing them actually giving feedback to a student. So it looks a little bit like this page here, and presumably there's been some discussion before this session, and these are the things down on the left-hand side here that the supervisor has asked you to particularly note when you're observing them in their as they're giving feedback to the learner. Now, quite often we're quite focused on reviewing what the learner's saying, so in this next video we'd like you to really focus on what the supervisor is doing as they are giving feedback to the student. And you can make some notes if you've printed out the form beforehand. Just jot down some notes about each of these areas, because these are the things that the supervisor's asked you to have a look at. So they're wanting you to ask, you know, how they feel the learning environment is that they've set up for the particular student, how well they communicate with the student, some strategies about whether the student's understanding what's happening in the area. So what are you seeing in this scenario that might promote that? And of course, how well they're promoting professionals. So are they showing respect to the learner? Are they being ethical in their practice? So under each of those areas, as you watch the video, we want you just to make a few notes as if you are the peer reviewing the supervisor as they having this particular interaction with the learner. And you can also write down anything else that you notice, but it does help if you actually focus your observation on a specific area that is the supervisor's actually wanting feedback on. So in a moment, I'll just go back to the previous slide for a minute. So we're going to actually get you to watch another video.
If people were trying to click on the link in the PowerPoint, that won't work. Make sure you're clicking on the link that's in the chat box, because you're just viewing Helen's screen. So your screen, the PowerPoint that you're watching isn't a live link, but the chat box link is live. So make sure that's where you're clicking. I've just pasted that link up.
Thanks, Narelle, that's fantastic. So if we will come back, this is again about another 5-minute video, so we will come back in a few minutes.
This scenario has been developed to complement the educational resource Work-Based Peer Review of Clinical Supervision Practice, which can be accessed at the GNARTN website, www.gnartn.org.au, and search for peer. Download it and template 2, the observation tool for this scenario. You should familiarise yourself with the peer review process by looking through the educational resource and the peer review observation tool before you complete the scenario. You are about to observe a supervisor giving feedback to a learner who is midway through their clinical experience. The supervisor has asked you to be their peer reviewer and provide them with feedback about the encounter.
Thanks for coming to see me. So, we agreed to meet today to go over your midterm feedback. The document here, so after we've gone over it, you'll need to sign it to confirm that you've received feedback. Is that okay?
Yeah, well, that's what I was expecting. I must admit, though, that these kind of conversations are a bit nerve-wracking.
Oh, what do you mean by nerve-wracking?
Well, I've had a situation previously where it didn't go so well in the feedback session.
Oh, that sounds really stressful.
It was, because my supervisor was quite intimidating, and I'd made an unfortunate mistake which I hadn't picked up on. So it was a very difficult meeting. So now, I'm always feeling a little bit on edge, wondering what I've missed or, what I hadn't done properly.
Well, the way I like to manage these sessions is firstly to collect a bit of 360-degree feedback from the other team members and then add it to my own observations. Then when we meet, I like to listen to your thoughts about aspects of your learning that you think are going well or your challenges. Then we go over the form together, set the learning goals for the next couple of weeks. Okay. It's important in these discussions to keep the actual assessment criteria in mind. You'll be familiar with those. The domains are professional behaviour, team interaction, applying knowledge to clinical practice and communication.
Oh, that sounds okay. Yeah.
So keeping those points in mind, what would you like to start talking about?
Well, I had that situation yesterday where I couldn't do what I was hoping to do because they were very upset and couldn't explain to me what was wrong. I felt terrible. I wasn't able to work out what was bothering the patient, so I didn't get to do what I'd hoped to do.
Can you explain to me what you did do?
Well, I had to call one of the other staff members for help, who knew the patient very well, and they were able to sort it out for me. But by the time he'd done that, it was time for him to go to physio.
Well, your actions sound quite appropriate to me. Knowing your own limits and using the expertise of your other team members is a really important clinical skill to develop. How did it feel?
Well, good and bad. Good because the patient became more settled and cooperative, so much so that by the time the physio came, he was happy to work with them. But bad because, well, I didn't sort it out myself.
Did the situation make you think of anything you might do differently next time?
Yes, I would definitely have read the recent notes. If I'd done that, I probably would have sorted out what was going on without wasting so much time.
Seems like a perfectly reasonable approach to that problem. Also, the other staff member did talk to me about the situation, and they said that despite struggling with the strong feelings of the patient, that you were really reassuring and appropriate. This is solid development for you, as I've noticed that previously you've been quite focused on your own actions rather than noticing how the patient is responding to you.
Thanks. It's good to hear that I'm improving.
So just watch that you give your patients your full attention, otherwise you can miss really vital clues. Now, about the form, have a look at the scores and tell me what your initial thoughts are.
Yeah, well, I think that the low score for applying knowledge to clinical practice is probably fair. I know that I had trouble, especially in the first couple of weeks, to work out how to use what I knew for each patient.
Okay, well, so that's your lowest score. But scores for team interaction and professional behaviour are quite high. Other people in our area have told me that you participate quite well. I've noticed that you're always punctual and you seem to finish your work well by the end of the day.
Well, I have been having a bit of trouble keeping on top of the long list of patients. I mean, the other day I had to ask another staff member for help, otherwise I wouldn't have been out of the door before 6.
Well, getting help from others is a really good strategy. Well done. So overall, I think you're progressing really well. You just need to keep on with your placement. So if you can sign here just to acknowledge that you've received some feedback. Any other questions?
No. Thanks for your time.
This project was funded by GNARTN and Flinders University in the Northern Territory, Australia.
So what we thought we'd do is just show you an example of what someone else might have jotted down as they watched that video. So this is just an example and just explain how we intended the peer review tool to be used. Right. So this is just an example of what someone, myself, Helen, might have recorded as we'd watched that video. And as I'm sure there's many ways, many things that you've probably picked up on the video, we deliberately designed that video to not be an incredibly difficult student or an incredibly fantastic supervisor or an incredibly difficult supervisor. We wanted to make it a little bit more subtle. And I think you'd probably agree mostly that that was a fairly good feedback session. But particularly what you would have noticed was under this promotes understanding area was that the supervisor did tend to gloss over the areas needing improvement. There was a domain in that checklist that they were showing the student which needed some improvement, and they tended to just gloss over, and I've jotted down here what the actual words were. You just need to keep on. And that's an example of the sort of things that we often may say to our students where it's not really specific enough for the student to actually plan for improvements. They certainly did open the session very well, explaining the purpose of the session and also clarified the learner's expectation, because they were quite a little bit nervous about getting feedback, and obviously had not a very good experience previously. And they certainly were quite encouraging in allowing the learner some time to review their actions and to comment on some of the scores. There was quite a calm manner with the learner, and they did encourage them to participate. So generally we're suggesting that this side of the form is where you would just note down some things that you actually observed during the session. And then to actually go the next step further. And the other side of the form is really perhaps just after the event to go away and just do a little bit of a summary of what the key information is that you would like to get back to the supervisor. So here what you could do is tick off the areas that you felt they performed well at and give some reinforcing comments to really summarise some of those other areas that were found. And then for the constructive comments, rather than just saying, well, you didn't give the learner enough of an agreed plan or allow strategies for improvement, use your experience and to perhaps suggest something more concrete that this observation that the supervisor could go away with. So one idea was that perhaps before is actually planning your supervisory session. Quite often we fit these things in within the 5-minute lunch or coffee break, and what we would probably suggest here is that just having a couple of minutes before you're actually meeting with your student or your person that you're supervising to actually plan out what you actually want to achieve and have some concrete suggestions ready to give the learner so that they go away with a specific plan as to how they're going to improve that particular area. So this is just one example. So the first side is really just for you to be jotting down some of your suggestions and ideas, and then the second side to have more summarising comments and perhaps some strategies that you might want to suggest for the supervisor. So that was just one example of how you might use a particular form for the supervisor. We have got a full educational resource which is freely available from everyone from the GNARTN website, which we'll put up in a moment. And basically the resource is structured to go through a series of steps, which is on the left-hand side, and then there are parts in the guide to support those steps. So particularly if you haven't been involved in peer review before, just understanding what we mean by the process and perhaps some different models you can try out depending on your environment. Then we suggest some ways of deciding what to review, how to select your peer. And then we have created this peer review tool, which is like based on all the research that's come out about what is good about a good supervisor. So just even reading through those ideas and descriptors and dot points can give you ideas just as a self-review that this is a part of supervision that perhaps you hadn't necessarily thought about. And we've modelled that on that competency resource, which Narelle actually put the link in previously, so that it does match with the HWA work on supervisory practice. So we have some peer review tool templates at the back of the resource. So we've used the template which is related to giving feedback to a student, but we created a couple of other examples, but there's nothing magical there. Anyone can create one of those as well. Then you conduct the review, which in this situation we were observing another supervisor giving feedback, but it could be that maybe you want to get together. We had some suggestions where supervisors actually get together and have a debrief. So it doesn't have to be an observation session. Then having some suggestions about debriefing, and we found some great resources about uses of questioning, how to give feedback, which we've actually included in the resource as well. And then further information about making further plans. So what can you actually do once you've been through this process. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of what's actually in this booklet. It's about 70 pages, and it does try to unpack each of these different areas of peer review. Now, Narelle's actually put into the chat box a direct link to the resource. As we said before, this work was supported by the GNARTN group, which is the Northern Australian Regional Training Network, which covers the top end of Western Australia, Queensland, and virtually all of the Northern Territory. And we've suggested they do a number of projects. So if you, it's rather a long URL that Narelle's put in there. If you forget that long URL, you can just type in the word peer in the search engine and of the resource, and that will come up with the resource. What we wanted to do now is we have like a short sort of couple of questions we'd like you to answer individually, which Narelle would launch, and then we've got a few minutes spare. So what we will do in a moment as well is actually just ask you to, we will then open up the microphones for any questions or comments as well. So I think Narelle is just about to launch the quiz. Interestingly, it looks like the screen has changed.
It should be available to people. I think, Helen, we can't see it because it is in the webinar structure. It's called a test. So
right. Yeah.
Maybe.
Thanks.
Yeah. Sue said it. Yes, it is working.
Okay. Thank you. We can't quite see the same thing that you guys are seeing. So we'll just pause for a couple more minutes, and then it would be great if we can have a bit more conversation in a moment. So, Narelle, what we might do is, if people would like to post up any questions, feel free. And if you would like to you have your microphone turned on to ask some questions, perhaps what might be best is if you can raise your hand, and then we'll know whether or not, then we can actually know who's raising their hand and open up the microphones.
Helen, just while people are thinking about that, if they've got any questions, it's probably worth saying that the resource is quite detailed. What we've been able to give you today is a little taster, a little overview, hoping to whet your appetite to go away and have a look at the resource and talk in your workplace about how you might be able to put this into practice. And I will just address a question that Leah put up about, you know, how do you select a peer? Can a learner be a peer? So we do actually suggest that it shouldn't be your line manager, because this is not a process that's associated with performance appraisal in any way. It's about professional development. I guess the learner being the peer, if the learner, if you are the supervisor of the learner, then that's a fairly big power imbalance. So you'd have to think pretty carefully about that. But the peer doesn't have to be someone in your profession. The peer could be, you know, maybe you're in a small workplace and there's only one of each profession there. The important thing is that they are willing to observe you in some way and offer some feedback on the points you've asked them to.
Yeah, so has anyone actually got a question that they'd like to ask, or perhaps a comment? Perhaps they might even like to comment on what we've put into the quiz. I think the quiz we were asking what people have learnt the most out of this session, or what they would actually like to do next. Actually interesting, we've discovering new things about this interface. So you've got a nice picture of the YouTube video still there, but that's fine.
Okay, so Alex has written up making a suggestion around the HETI training. And the HETI training, I'd need to take advice from New South Wales people, but I thought that was only available if you were a New South Wales public service employee. But I think the other point that Alex makes is it's all about having peers, reflecting with other supervisors and practicing. And I would fully support that, because everything that we have found as we've looked through the literature and put this sort of process into practice in our own teaching is that you gain so much more when you invest in it. So I would encourage you to give it a go. It doesn't have to be big and fancy. It can be very small. It can be a one-off. It can be a full-on, you know, whole of workplace. Whatever works for you, give it a go.
And Serena put in an interesting question too, is how often should you be doing peer review of a supervisor? Look, I think as often as practical. Of course, it's a matter of finding the time. Narelle and I actually often peer review each other when we're doing workshops, and even though we know each other's teaching style quite well, there's always something new that we can pick up from each other. So I'm a bit of a teaching enthusiast, so I would say as often as you can possibly practically do. And Serena suggests that it would be perhaps a good idea to introduce it more frequently with someone who's newer to supervising, and then possibly reduce over time. I mean, I think it really needs to be the person who's supervising seeking out the peer reviewer rather than a manager mandating it. So, yeah, I don't know if Narelle's got more things to comment on.
Yes, I would, there's not a lot of evidence yet around peer review of supervision in a health context. Certainly, some of the medical professions actually have certification that people have to do in order to be a supervisor, but allied health is not anywhere near that in general. In terms of certification. This is not supposed to be a certification process. It's about a professional development activity that's located in your workplace, and particularly for people in rural and remote areas where accessing professional development is a difficult thing, to have a peer in your workplace who's interested in understanding how to supervise better, how to make those experiences for the students or the new graduates that come through your workplace more effective in terms of their learning. It's a professional development activity for both the supervisor and the peer reviewer, is our experience. And that follows up to Samantha's question, can the reviewer be someone who's a lower level than you? Yes, because it's very, very much about being supervisor-centred, if we want to make up a new little piece of jargon. As the supervisor being peer reviewed, you've asked a peer to review you, and you've set the groundwork. You've said, I want you to check. I want you to watch this. Helen, back to you.
Sorry, there was an interesting comment from Calgary Physiotherapy about the benefit of combining video and peer review. Certainly, I think sometimes it's not always possible to actually be present in the room when you're to peer review a supervisor. So, you know, it is possible, especially with our phones these days, to record a session. Mind you, you would need to definitely get the consent of the person that you're perhaps interacting with during your supervision. That's really important. And certainly that's how I've been reviewed as a teacher at a university. I had some people watch a recording of me doing an interaction with a group of students for my teaching, and that was quite a valuable process. But of course, I got agreement from the students that someone else was going to actually be watching the video. The question about the certificates, if you'd registered, this interface will give you a certificate of attendance. We're not able to actually edit the information on the certificate, so there will be a certificate coming to your email as you registered. There also will be an evaluation, and we'd really love people to fill out the evaluation. I'm sure we're all smiling as we say that word, evaluation. So you will get a follow-up email from me via GoToTraining as well. Just looking through other questions at the moment, and I've neglected and haven't actually looked to see. Samantha had a hand up. Would you like us to open the we can open the microphone and give that a go if you like. Samantha, I've activated your microphone now, so possibly you'll be able to talk if you've got a microphone because your hand's up at the moment.
So maybe not.
Just waiting to see if anyone else would like to talk. We're allowing you to now because we have a couple of minutes free. So just put your hand up, and I'm just scrolling through the list, and it's just difficult to open up everyone's microphone.
I just wanted to address John's point. I think it was John talking about people would really like peer review of their clinical practice, I suspect, and struggle to find the time to do that, let alone peer review of their clinical supervision. So our perspective on that is peer review of clinical practice is a fantastic professional development tool also. Peers can be such a valuable asset. We think that peer review of clinical supervision is going to be most successful if it's supported by an organisational culture that values it and helps set up processes to make it work. But even doing it once is still a learning experience that can be useful to you and give you some new strategies, because the problem is when you're a supervisor with a learner, it tends to be a pretty private sort of process. So by opening it up to someone else's observation, you get insights into things that might be blind spots for you. So don't set your sights so high and you think, you know, you've got to do this so many times in a year or whatever. Just try it once, give it a go, and give it a go with someone who is, is going to be able to follow through with you, and we'd be very happy to hear about it, how it went for you. Now, I did also notice that Lisa, I think, or maybe Sue, earlier in the chat said they've got some hard copies of the resource still available. So if you want a hard copy of the resource, scroll back through the chat, and I'm pretty sure it was Lisa Crouch that you posted that.
It was Lisa.
And so she put her email up there.
She did. The chat's getting, we knew the chat would get quite long and difficult to scroll through, so.
Okay, I think we're just about finished with our time. Any final questions? All right, Lynette's put a question. Is there any impact on the learner while you are performing the peer review on their supervisor? That's a really nice research question. We haven't read anything that says there is a positive or a negative impact, but we do know that supervising learners has a positive impact on clinical practice. So I would think that that would be a multiplier effect. If as a supervisor you knew you were being watched by somebody else, the quality of your supervision is likely to increase, but I don't have any evidence for that. And Bernadette commented that she had herself videoed while teaching and found it very valuable, but the student wasn't relaxed with the video. She felt kind of awkward and wasn't her usual self, even though she was keen to do it. Okay, so there's an anecdote of a time when the video itself was a bit of a inhibitor in the interaction. All right, I think probably it's time to finish. We've used our hour 15 minutes. And it might cut off. I'm a bit worried about that, Helen.
Yeah, I don't think so, Narelle. I think we're okay on the time. So, any other questions? So basically, we have recorded this, and the plan was that the recording, and that won't include the chat, it will be able to be, it'll put up into YouTube again, which will then appear on the GNARTN website, which is where the website is. Perhaps, Narelle, can you just close that? Might just close the test, and then I think that will then mean that the GNARTN webpage will appear on the screen again. Yes, so that's the website where you can actually find the resource. And we really appreciated having your attendance here. We think webinars are great ways to interact, and I apologise for not allowing people to talk. We just felt with such a large number it would have got a little bit difficult to manage in the time that we had. So we're quite keen to try out this interface again, and good luck everybody from wherever you went.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks.